And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Nathaniel Gillis, lecturer, recovering demonologist, who's here to talk to us about the true nature of ETs and more. Nathaniel, it's great to have you, and welcome.
Thank you for having me, sir. It's been a while, man. I've been a fan of you and your work for a long time, and always dreamed of being on your show. And today's a gift, so I appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I'm honored to have you as my guest. So let's start from the beginning. How did you get into becoming a demonologist and all this other paranormal stuff?
So my first encounter with the phenomenon when I was 8 years old is when I was 8 years old. My parents had moved into a new house, and even before we purchased the home, you know how you do, you kind of take a tour of it. And so here I was, an 8-year-old kid, walking around in an empty house when my dad led me by the hand into what would become my future room. When I walked into the room itself, I was met with a pervasive stench. Now, mind you, there's nothing in it. And not just nothing, but there's no one, I should say.
Did your dad recognize the stench as well?
No, never did. Matter of fact, the only thing he ever told me about anything paranormal in the house was when we were moving out. He kind of told me, he goes, it kind of felt like you were being watched, didn't it?
Hmm.
But at that time, no, not at all. He was kind of oblivious to it, but all of my senses were picking whatever that was up. And so I'm kind of poking my head in the closet, looking around and almost imagining where I'm going to place everything once we move in. And it was, for some reason, I got on my hands and knees and I looked underneath the bed. And so as soon as I opened my eyes, I kind of pulled the blanket up, and there was this little girl. She was maybe about 6 years old. She had long flowing black hair, very pale in complexion. She was wearing a white linen dress, looked to have been made during the turn of the century. And that's when I freaked out and I ran out of the room back into the living room with my parents and the realtor. And I didn't say anything until I got into the car on the way home. But she didn't belong in the house. Once we moved into the home, I got to know the neighborhood and the neighbors. She neither had lived there in the past, didn't belong in the neighborhood. She wasn't a child of, some family there. That's when I realized at a very young age that there was something in the house that wanted to appear as something I would trust as a young boy. And so that was my very first, I guess, encounter with the phenomenon.
Did that change you in any way? I mean, did you go on this,
Mhm.
start down a path of paranormal, or you were young and it didn't really impact you that much?
It left, yes, it left a feeling within me almost, obviously an impression. But there have been times in my field, especially when I'm on cases, where while I don't see the incarnation, like I don't witness that apparition in the investigation, I'll still smell that pervasive stench, and I'll still walk away feeling this. Really, what it was a complete loneliness, depravity, if you will.
Can you describe for us the stench that you're talking about?
Yes, it was kind of a combination of sulfur and rotting or organic matter, like decomposition. And of course, as an 8-year-old boy, I had no frame of reference for that whatsoever. And I was trying to place it within the context of my life, but I had nothing, absolutely nothing. And so it was upon moving into the house that, first of all, I noticed that the apparition was never seen again. She was never witnessed, that little girl, ever again. But that presence was made manifest over time. Whatever that was, it would kind of mutate in its pathology. At one point, what was once a little girl would turn into a shadow figure at nighttime, stare at me through my window. There was a hovering black cloud that would kind of manifest in the corner of my room at night. And it's funny, my friend, because even now I'm 36 years old. Even now, sometimes I'll get to talking about this subject with my parents, and my mother will kind of pull me aside and she'll start, did you remember telling me about the witch you saw? I'm like, I have no memory of that. And she goes on with the story, and I start, it triggers this feeling inside of me was, okay, there was a lot more that occurred in that house than I can even remember. But in my experience, I started to ask myself if this was a singular intelligence. Was this a ghost? Right? I went through the whole Rolodex of phenomena. Was this a ghost? Was this the demon? Was this an alien? I had no real idea. And so I was forced to go into the arms of my local church for advice and for answers, which, if I could be frank with you, did more harm than good, because I thought I didn't have the answers. I'm a kid, I play video games and watch cartoons. But I'm going to, 50, 60-year-old men who went through seminary, Bible school. And instead of them wrapping their arms around me and saying, okay, we understand a little bit of what's going on in your life, they kind of shunned me and placed me like in the asylum, if you will, right? It's like, oh, you're crazy. We're going to gaslight you. So that's when I realized as an 8-year-old kid that number one, this is very important for people who are going to watch this. Number one, I knew I had to coexist with this intelligence. It was following me. When I would have sleepovers, it would follow me into the houses. So that's when I started to gauge kind of not just its presence in the room with me, but I started to monitor my thought life. What I realized was that sometimes it would send very dark and insidious thoughts to my mind in terms of like depression, loneliness, I'm not good enough. And it would almost kind of monitor whether or not I believed in it. And the more I started believing in these thoughts, the more it became empowered and the more manifest it was in that room. It kind of culminated in a nightmare. It was a looping nightmare. It was always in black and white, but it had to do with addiction and with self-harm. And then, as soon as the nightmare would end, at the time of his choosing, not mine, I would wake up and I could feel this. It was almost like a pulsating presence in that room. And so that was from between the ages of about 8 to 15. About 15 to now 36, which is a little bit longer of a time period. Um, my father had been flying in Hebrew scholars from Israel. He's a pastor. And I had the opportunity to kind of, pick their brains, bend their ears. And I say, what's your hypothesis on what I could have encountered in my youth? And that's when I started getting introduced to the Eastern thought regarding demonology, possession, and pregnancy. And that was pretty much the springboard into my career in the field of the paranormal.
So it appears that this is some sort of being that could manifest itself into different entities, like the little girl and
Correct.
whatever else you encounter.
Mhm.
So are you saying it's a fallen angel or a demon or an earthbound human after death or what?
That's a very profound question, and one that is deeply meaningful in the field, because what we have done, at least from my perspective, is compartmentalize this intelligence. And that has been an organic response and very even an instinctual response on the part of our species. What we're dealing with is a phenomenon that can create physiological constructs, apparitions, something that looks the part of reality. You could reach out and touch it. We've seen this in seances. You could communicate with it. But the incarnation doesn't really define the intelligence behind the mask. So that's what I started to realize early on in my experiences was, okay, it seemed like it wanted to be a little girl at the time. And then, of course, it wanted to be a shadow figure, but only at the time. And so that's when I kind of grew into the data set of the phenomenon where I hypothesized is, okay, is this a singular intelligence that is incarnating as various archetypes in order to moderate human behavior? And that is my current hypothesis. So are they alien or are they demons? Well, I can tell you with a surety, I vetted the demonic. And the demons that we're seeing in paranormal research, even in hauntology, are not tethered to any historical record.
When you talk about that they want to affect human behavior. In what way?
To moderate it,
To what
to even
extent?
to manage our perceptions, to destabilize our instinctual awarenesses. And they do this by virtue of appealing to the archetype within us. I'll give you a case in point, my friend. Well, years ago, I was doing research and I wasn't even really the field. I was working at a factory and I was doing my best to kind of balance work and then, the hobby. And so, but anyways, one night I got off of work on a Friday night, go home, go to bed. I go into this deep sleep. In the nightmare, I am being attacked by a shadow figure. It is female, long black hair. She was featureless, but she looked identical to my ex now, but my fiance at the time looked identical to her. If you were to place her in darkness, your eyes adjust. I thought that was my ex. I thought that was Ellie at the time. And so in the dream, I'm saying, Ellie, is this you? What's going on? What are you doing? Why are you attacking me? And so I'm shaking myself awake, but to my utter astonishment, when I woke up, it was still there. So it was present both within my nightmare and within this reality. And more to my point here, what it was almost doing was using archetypes of my own memory and my consciousness as a way to camouflage its own identity in my presence. Seen that, where the phenomenon will incarnate through these archetypes. And what my point here is, even within demonology, when we have people like Ed Lorraine Warren, Ed Warren even talks about a case where he witnessed a demon in a house. It was horns and hooves. And so what you have here, again, with even Christianity, you have Christian demonologists who don't yet realize that the demons they're witnessing and hauntings do not line up with Christians or Christianity as a whole. Why? Right? Is it, again, even the horns and hooves moniker, it's not original to the text. Never was. The only written text we have in the Holy Bible is obviously Revelation, but it's not a horns and hoof devil. It's a reptilian. It's a dragon with horns, but we're not seeing that in houses. Mhm. So literally, what I'm saying here is that the phenomenon is playing into our hands with respect to Western scholarship, especially within the paranormal. It will manifest as demons to those who don't realize that that is merely an archetype of religious pop culture. It's not tethered to any correct historicity. So then I ask myself, as a child, was that a real woman, a real girl, rather? No. Then what about the demons we're seeing in these encounters? Are they tethered to any real historical record? They're not. But if you were to sit down someone and say, hey, listen, you seem to be a demonologist. What does a demon look like? They're going to, right? You see where I'm going, brother? They're going to draw you a horned and hoofed creature, not realizing that's lamb. That's not the demonic within the context they think it is. And so that's when I started to really kind of deconstruct not just the phenomenon itself, but specifically demonology. What are they? What is this? A good friend of mine, I did a show with him recently. He told me a story about how he was on a paranormal investigation. It was a malevolent haunting. Of course, it's got to be demonic. And so they had the archetype present in the investigation, right? The three scratches on the wall, three scratches on the skin. So instantly they're like, okay, this is a demon. So they go get their priest, their local priest, and the priest comes in to perform an exorcism. And now I'm gonna kind of unmask the proto intelligence wearing the archetype. So now the priest says, okay, this has got to be a demon. We're going to treat it like a demon. And so he takes a vial of holy water, places it in the most haunted room of the house. And in real time, my friend, they watched as this entity began to siphon the holy water. Slowly, slowly, which about an hour later, it's completely gone. So why would it manifest as the demonic, but completely transcend all of those rules once you interact with it? Because it's trying to moderate our behavior. And so my current hypothesis, again, you kind of trigger me here. My current hypothesis is that if I can't trust the little girl that manifested to me at 8 years old, and I can't even trust that these are demonic in terms of manifestation, how can I trust that they're extraterrestrial? Number one. Number two, if they can create physiological constructs, and we've seen this in seances, to the point that it can literally materialize by hardening the moisture in the air, it can create its own image, allow us to touch it, but dematerialize it to a wall. Then that means that we, not we, but even demonologists, we need to start reconsidering our cases. If it can create an apparition that could disappear, then it can also create something that would appear as demonic to us. So what are we really dealing with? It's a proto-intelligence that's masquerading as various archetypes, hoping that we will compartmentalize it in the field.
Now, when you use the word proto-intelligence, that to
Mhm.
me means that it's something that happened before intelligence was created, like a basic version of intelligence.
Yes, what's so fascinating about all of this, at least in my perspective, is that in these cases you'll always have an archetype, but then you'll have an antitype, something that completely contradicts, right, what we think it is. And so even in Father Sinistrari Vimino, his research, he was an exorcist, and he's walking on a dirt road back from dinner, going home. He's got all of his gear on, right? He's got the cross, he's got the holy water. And from the woods walks up this demon. He's looking at this thing, and again, the archetype was present. This is what I am. And so he begins to play by the rules of the demonic. Here's the cross, here's the holy water. About 30 minutes later, he realized, I've done everything I possibly can. What are you? And that's where I'm at right now on the field. A couple of other researchers I've been working with in the UK, we're all in that kind of mode. Because one thing that has to be said here is that the very first time we encounter the extraterrestrials, right, it wasn't in Area 51, we're doing seances through Ouija boards. Albert Bender building an altar in his attic. Very strange stuff, right? George Hunt Williamson building like a homemade Ouija board, and suddenly what once was spirit, what once was, shall I say, a deceased ancestor, is now extraterrestrial. And the problem I'm having, and others are as well, that I'm working with, is okay, we've learned how to vet the familiars. But whatever this intelligence is doing now, it seems to be updating into a new archetype of which we can no longer vet. Case in point, Ted Rice, and I know French mentioned this in her interview with you. Ted Rice encountered an entity that looked like his deceased grandfather. That's the archetype. That's the incarnation. But when he compared the behavioral patterns of his deceased grandfather with what this entity was doing, that's when the archetype was deconstructed. And he realized that these are masks. I can go into that further, but that's where I'm at now. I'm to the point where I believe that this is a singular intelligence that, in an effort to kind of blind us, has allowed us to compartmentalize it.
So are you saying that the ETs that are out there
Mhm.
are all created by this singular intelligence? Or maybe there's a bunch of them that are materializing as ETs as well as their
Mhm.
ships and everything? Like
Well,
they're creating
yeah.
these physical crafts too for us?
So it's a fascinating point. So now we're going to have to get into, I guess, to answer that question, I would have to get into the hybridization program and give you some case studies where you'll notice, hopefully everybody else will notice as well, that the phenomenon is compartmentalizing itself in our eyes because it doesn't want to be connected to negative case studies. Doesn't want to have to answer for situations that they put our species in to where we were compromised. If I can suggest that the alien abduction phenomenon is different than the incubus phenomenon in the medieval period, then I don't even have to put up with those case studies. This is new. And so what I'm looking at here, even within the hybridization program, it's not modern. It's primeval. The incarnation may be modern. The incantations they're implementing are ancient. And so that's one of the what was one of the biggest highlights of my research. It was instrumental in showing me what was going on. Again, with respect to the field, people like to say, the hybridization program, it's all extraterrestrial. It like the Ouija boards, right? Like the seances, it didn't begin extraterrestrial. It began with specifically women being visited by entities, inducing them into dreamlike states, implanting a fetus inside of them, placing their consciousness into that fetus, and then removing both of them at the same time. We didn't know that, at least demonology, because at least my field studied just demonology. We weren't studying phenomenology, which is a macro perspective of the larger phenomenon. So even within the 16th century, with what's called the Debuk legend, we have cases in the Levant, specifically Safdi, Israel, of women encountering entities that were visiting them in dream states to where they literally couldn't consent. They had no idea what was going on. So the next day, they were having issues. They were having memories that allegedly did not belong to them. Consciousness was residing inside of them. And so they would go to their local exorcist trying to understand what is this. And then, we're going to do this. And then 2 weeks later, come back for some more help. We're going to check out the situation even more. Upon their return, my friend, they were pregnant, literally showing to the point that rabbis were performing the lavouche method, which was placing the thumbs on the wrists of these hybrid mothers. They felt two pulses and two heartbeats in one body. So that's when demonology asked a very important question that ufology has yet to. And that was, are these women pregnant by the entities or are they pregnant with them? And is this the self-replication of species, which I believe it is? If that is the case, then hybridization as a whole in ufology needs to take a step back. And again, look at phenomenology. What is this? Look at the breadth of work. Look at these case studies. So even then, what I'm suggesting is it's not just that the altars did not originate with ET. We've seen them in antiquity. Neither did the Ouija boards, neither did the seances, neither did the hybridization program. So is it possible that we as a species are being manipulated by something that has the ability to incarnate as whatever it wants to, just as long as we no longer see through the mask?
Do you think that the being that was with you as a child was a proto intelligence or a hybrid?
Mhm. I think it was an archetype. I think that obviously as an 8-year-old boy, I had cousins her age, right? My little brother was even younger than her, but I had friends. I was only 8, 8 and 6. It's not big of a not a big difference. But my point here is I think that was an archetype designed to manipulate me, appearing as innocent as possible. We've seen that. I've had cases where the phenomenon will call people by name. By name. I mean, imagine that. Nathaniel, commune with me, talk to me. And so it appears that if the phenomenon is incarnating as these archetypes, either it's manipulating our perception of reality or it's manipulating reality itself.
Well,
And
what
that is a terrifying theory.
what is the end game for these beings?
I think that there's a measure of consent that they're looking for. You know, what's the purpose of manifesting as a deceased loved one if you could do whatever you want to do? Would be no purpose. I had a case study years ago, and I know French mentioned this in her interview as well, where this experiencer had been taken by these beings from her youth. They were monitoring her fertility. And so they would run experiments on her. And she would go back and she'd remember later on, oh my God, that wasn't just a dream. And so she said there for a period, they were manifesting, but when they manifested in her room, and here's the archetype, it was always in her favorite cartoon or her favorite, what was it? Yeah, it was a cartoon character. I think it was Mickey Mouse or something. But it would always manifest as that entity. And she said the next thing you know, years go by, she's taller, she's more mature. She's no longer reading comic books. She's no longer watching cartoons. She's matured now. And she said, and she thought they were going to leave her alone until she realized that that same energy was in the room one night. She told me, Nathaniel, I began to emotionally prepare myself. This hasn't happened in a while, but something's here. She said, and next thing you know, there's that cartoon character. Now, this is fascinating to me. She said that now that she no longer watched those cartoons, she realized that that can't possibly be what it is appearing to be. And so that entity realized that the archetype was no longer fitting into her reality. This is strange too. This is probably the strangest account I've heard. She said that's when its eyes began to move back and forth, staring at her eyes back and forth. And she said the only way I can explain it was that it was measuring my belief in its image. So it appears that there is a species that has to be, it has to be present with us, but in an effort to be present with us, it also has to be absent from us. And so it realized that the best way to do them is to incarnate as these archetypes, so that we as a species would constantly argue over demons, aliens, angels, ghosts, and not realizing that this could very well be the same intelligence. I mean, my friend, I've actually caught the phenomenon sharing information with the guide. And when the experiencer goes to their guide, the guide's no longer there. Almost like a new program superseded the old one. And now this is the new archetype that they're encountering. So whatever we're dealing with, there it does seem to be a singular intelligence that has diversified itself like a vein, connecting into our species. Therefore, it can interact with us. But every time we try to go beyond the veil, it corrects. Or in this case, with the experiencer, it updates. You don't like this? You don't believe in this image? I'm going to self-update in order to be present with you, but really absent from.
Some people believe that there are beings on the other side that feed off our negative energy,
Mhm,
and perhaps we're forced into reincarnation over and over. Do
mhm.
you think this is what's going on?
There is a measure of soul hunting present that can no longer be ignored, I should say. I mean, it's not just that we are seeing people employ necromancy to contact extraterrestrials. Again, overlapping. I used to think, right, that these were co-present intelligence. They're separate. They're just present together. It appears now that one is weaponizing the mask of the other. We've seen that over and over again. But with respect to consciousness, it does seem to be a currency or an energy source to them. I mean, over and over again, specifically within ufology, we're seeing more cases where people are being abducted and seeing deceased loved ones. And what's more disturbing, perhaps, is that you can kind of pick your poison here. None of them are good, or at least comforting. I mean, either they know when people die, or they are the people that have died. Which one? I mean, but my point here is that either hauntology is different than demonology is different than ufology, or they're all underneath the same umbrella. And if they are, which is that's the emerging model now, if they are, then now we need to ask a deeper question: are we being manipulated? Because what I encountered in my youth was inducing me into these really, really dark states. And then the more I believed in that, the stronger it became. And this, again, this goes back to the experiencer in the cartoon character. It was measuring her belief in its archetype. When it realized that there was disbelief, I don't believe in that. It had to update. It had to improvise. And so, if you look at the stream of events throughout history, we have altars at antiquity, allegedly built to gods. Right now, Tim Taylor's in the desert building an altar to ET.
There are many people who will claim that their ET contact was benevolent and ETs
Mhm,
are good. Is
mhm.
it possible that there are also positive beings out there that manifest themselves into good ETs and basically we're an updated version of good and bad ETs from angels versus demons?
Well, that would take the deconstructing of the angel legend. I mean, one of the earliest theories regarding what they were they were kind of an evolved consciousness. And this is where you get the Elohim in biblical antiquity, and then later on the Rephaim that became demons in Christian demonology. Um, what I would suggest is that there seems to be a strain out there, I should say, strain that is self-serving. And so it's not that they're immoral. There is no morality. It's almost H.P. Lovecraft's cosmicism, where they're deeply immune to human suffering. And so whatever happens is a means to an end. And then, you're being, and I've seen this within the field too. They will court the consciousness of the experiencer. And at the time of their choosing, that archetype, the guide, the loved one, the deceased ancestor, will be pulled off. And then what we are looking into, right, making eye contact with, is the singular proto intelligence that has been present all along. I'll give you another case study that kind of blew the lid off my own research. Is I was doing a lecture one night on scarification, skin anomalies, and incubi encounters where not only teeth marks, but scars in their body underneath the skin to the surface manifested. And so upon the conclusion of the lecture, I get an email and I get on the phone call with this experiencer. And he said, he goes, I have a gift. He said, but I was trained by my father. I was like, okay, this is really interesting. So he's talking to me on the phone, but he's also emailing me pictures and photographic evidence. His testimony is disturbing. And I think people need to really, really just think about what he's saying here. He said that his father was a remote viewer. He was a celebrity apprentice, essentially. Like he was being mentored by celebrities and politicians, and that he would go into sessions out of body into a metallic room. Mm. And he would see entities that would flank him on the right and left sides. They would give him messages, and they told him, I am your guide. They are his guides, rather. He said that he would go back into his body, then pick up the phone, call that celebrity, call that politician, give them a prophecy or something to help their careers. He said, but then one night, he said his dad went into one of these sessions like he normally did, hundreds of them. He said, but about an hour later, his father's stumbling down the stairway. He's white as a ghost. He's crying uncontrollably, and he can't talk. And so they're trying to console him, like, what's going on here? What's going on? And he passed out. He had a massive heart attack. When they got into the hospital, they were pulling off his shirt, trying to, get him to revive again. And underneath his skin to the surface were sigils, three of them: Star of David, a cross, and an Egyptian hieroglyphic. He said, Nathaniel, we are watching them as they're moving their way underneath the skin to the surface. He said, they started taking pictures of it. He said the next day his father was stabilized. They got to talk to him. What happened? He said, well, he said, I went into my session with my guides. I'm in this metallic room. They looked the part. They acted the part. He said, but I started asking them questions, and they didn't know the questions. They didn't know the answers. They had no idea. And he said, I realized that these were not my guides at all, that something had hijacked that archetype. He said, next thing I know, I'm slammed back into my body and I feel this burning sensation underneath my skin. What's most important here, though, is that that model collapses a lot in the field. All the guides are not good guides. Number one. Number two, these could not have been demons because, as every occultist knows, that sigils are not designed. Like, you don't have the demonic carving sigils in the skin. That's the nuance of the practitioner. So whatever they were almost outside of all models. And that's kind of where I'm at. Whatever this is, it is employing ritual magic. And that's why we've seen them in seances. That's why they need altars. That's why they want sacrifices. That's why they want Ouija boards. And I have evidence even now that they're performing rituals on experiencers. So you see where I'm a lone wolf, and in every sense of the word, it's not demonology, it's not ufology, it's something much deeper going on.
How do we protect and or defend ourselves from these beings?
I would test the spirits. I hate to pull that out of the ether, but test them. The archetypes they can incarnate as are many, many. Deceased loved ones, the guides, the alien, the extraterrestrial, the god, all of them. And so, the number one thing I do is I say, okay, what is it manifesting as? Does that coincide with the historical record? If that is Darren Edna, why is she a Buffalo Bills fan and not a Green Bay Packers fan? I mean, literally stuff that is that simple. We've had cases where they're in the military and one patch is on the wrong side, right? So the incarnation, it has bugs in it. And so, and it's sometimes, this is fascinating too, where it will incarnate based on the literacy of the observer. Whereas, like, right, I'm Jesus. Okay, are you the historical Jesus of the first century, or are you the Jesus that individual believes in? You compare the two. That's when in my own career, I've realized, okay, that you can't be that person. There's something really wrong here because that was not even him in antiquity. Number two is messages. You know, when we're hearing that, okay, the lady in white is Hathor or is some other mythical entity, the first archetype is Mother Mary. Would Mother Mary have ever told that? Did she ever say that? No. So what we're witnessing literally is the donning of a mask in order to give messages that do not coincide again with the archetype they're manifesting as. That's number one. Number two, it's iron, and I can't explain why. I thought that I was alone in the field with respect to my, I guess, appreciation for iron, because I've used it in hauntings and in cases. It works. I don't know why. It could be some scientific method. I don't know why. But iron is effective. And those are really the only two things that I go to.
So I guess holy water and crosses don't work.
Well, outside of the case study I gave you prior to that, and then the Carmen Snedeker haunting or the haunting in Connecticut is another manifestation of the archetype and the antitype, where the phenomenon is present, but it's wearing one as a mask. In the haunting in Connecticut case study, it was a violent haunting, and they had cornered the entity in a room again. And so their best option was to take a crucifix and place it at the doorway there. Well, the next day they woke up, the crucifix was removed, the presence was in the room. Why? Right. So we have the kind of two coinciding theories in the field, and that is that the name of Jesus always works. It sometimes works up until it manifests as Jesus. Quite literally, the phenomenon weaponizing the very name we call on and saying, here it is. Dr. Carla Turner had a case study where that happened, where it wasn't even the historical Jesus. It wasn't Yeshua of the first century, right? It was the white Presbyterian version that wasn't historical at all, my friend, right? That's when you see this can't possibly be true. There's something here that's literally using my consciousness to project the archetype it's manifesting as. So that is deeply apparent. But my connection I'm trying to make now, at least, is that the ritual magic aspect of it is not a bug, it's a feature. So outside, right, outside of all the archetypes, there are things, certain behavioral patterns that the phenomenon responds to. And it's not only responding to them, but it's also performing them on individuals.
Is this being still in contact with you? And if it was, and you wanted it to leave you alone
Mhm.
and go away, what would you do?
I would call on a deity. That does sometimes work. Okay, it does sometimes work. I know Joe Jordan in MUFON recommends that. Um, I've had cases, others have in the UK, where it wasn't the most secular, right, that the phenomenon targeted. It was the most devout, and it targeted them, literally targeted them. And each and every time they would reach out for a deity, it would only get stronger. So where I'm at presently is I'm questioning all of these archetypes, wondering if we're not being gaslit or contoured by an intelligence that has always wanted worship, always wanted altars, always wanted sacrifices. And yet now in the 21st century, it's reincarnating as something novel and new. And yet when you look back at its behavioral patterns, hybridization is there. Necromant. Did you know that they're contacting extraterrestrials by virtue of necromancy?
I don't know if that's the same thing as in CE5, where they basically meditate to try to contact
Right.
beings.
No, no. Yeah, so that's also fascinating too. But yeah, necromancy is being employed to contact aliens. But my point here, everyone, is that if this is new, why is it old? Right? You see this, it's pervasive in this field to where, like Tim Taylor right now, he took Diana Walsh Bosuka out in the desert. In the desert, here's my altar to the phenomenon. And so again, this is why I'm such a lone wolf in the field, right? Is because I'm not, I mean, outside of it all, and saying, okay, I don't believe it's demonic and I don't believe it's alien. There's something out there that just like it manifested as the cartoon character, just like it incarnated as my ex, is looking within the human psyche, picking out archetypes we want to believe in, and inhabiting all of them as a mask. At the end of the day, Ouija boards are present, altars are present, ritual magic is present. So whatever that is pretty much what I'm studying.
Is it possible that this being is far more intelligent than we are and we're just misinterpreting what it's up to?
Well, I think if it was that intelligent, if that it was that intelligent, I would think that it would have a better way to communicate with us. You know, why not just be you? That would be my question. If you are my dear Aunt Edna, like with Ted Rice, right? If you're not Ted Rice's grandfather, because for those who don't know, read Masquerade of Angels, Taken, and it's fascinating by Dr. Carla Turner. But if that is dear Aunt Edna, don't attack me. And if you aren't dear Aunt Edna, why would you want me to think you are? Even with respect to that individual I worked with, if you are not my guides, why not tell me straight up? Why lean into that archetype? It appears again that they're moderating our behaviors. They don't want us to see the truth. And there is almost an augmented reality around us to where, in order to evade our detection, they have to blend in. They have to blend in. It's I liken it to an artificial habitat where we have caretakers that walk in and do what they want, but the illusion must be present. One of my mentors, a good friend, is Steve Mara. He's from the UK. He's done a lot of parapsychological work over there, and it's incredible. He's one of my heroes in the field. But he had a case study of his fascinating where the phenomenon was taking things out of a home, specifically a white coffee mug, and he's taking them. And it came with a group of coffee mugs. So the family had the other coffee mugs it came with, just not that one. They checked everywhere, my friend. Kitchen, living room, everywhere. Couldn't find it. They go in one day, there it is. They line them all up. The collection's now all here. But what's going on with that coffee mug? And so Steve, he's absolutely brilliant. He takes it back to his lab. There was a different isotopic ratio with the coffee mug taken and replaced than the other mugs that it came with. Can I suggest the phenomenon is not about disclosure? It's doing its best to preserve our perception of reality. So that means that there is something present that we cannot see because they're hiding it. Now, I will suggest this as well, that a lot of these UFOs are not just coming through us. It's not, okay, we're possessed or some spooky thing. No, that they are apparitions in and of themselves. And again, their ability to create physiological constructs is so understated. That would mean, and we've seen this with Nick Redfern's book, or research rather, regarding the Men in Black, that sometimes people have thought they're talking to individuals. They're not, it's the phenomenon. And so if we look at its ability to incarnate, Either we're looking at someone who is invading reality itself or something that created it. That's what I would suggest it is, one of the two. In whatever that proto intelligence is, has the ability to connect with an experiencer and press pause, where the free will goes out the window. Whatever is in us, it commandeers. And so there is this kind of symbiotic relationship between us and it.
What's the difference between an incubus and a succubus?
So in traditional systematic demonology, an incubus was first interpreted as an entity appearing to a female as a male. And these case studies include the inducing of the female into a dreamlike state. She thinks it's just a nightmare. It's a former boyfriend, a deceased husband, it's a lover. And so consent is given. And then, to their astonishment, they wake up the next day and they have bruises on their body that directly correlate with the experience in the dream. That's the classical incubus. Later on, like in the 16th century, we have researchers. One of them was Father Sinister of Amino, where he was in homes within an hour of the incubus being present. And here's something that will directly relate to ufology. He was collecting secretions from the entity on the dresses of the experiencers. Sounds a lot like Bedio. And so, yes, that's the incubus entity. But if we follow their bloody footprints, we are inevitably landing in the Levant again, the debug phenomenon, where it wasn't just the implanting of the fetus, it was the implanting of the consciousness within the fetus. And then when the phenomenon had finally merged memory into matter, it plucked both of them out at the same time. That was the original missing fetus syndrome that we're now misinterpreting within ufology. Here's why: it's weaponized. This phenomenon is intentionally compartmentalizing itself. Now, I've been fortunate enough to have conversations with both types of experiencers. They have both the same stories, the same symbols, the same bodily scarifications. The only difference between the two comes when someone says they're two separate entities, two separate intelligences. They're not. But that's essentially where we are with the incubus.
Now, what about the succubus?
The succubus is also a fascinating component in demonology. This was supposed to be an entity that appears to the male as the female. I had a case study like this too. It's fascinating because this stuff happens, right? People don't talk about it. They're scared to. But this stuff happens. I have a good friend of mine that told me a story about his ex-girlfriend. He said, he said we had been broken up for almost a year. We deleted numbers. We changed numbers. I got a different job. I'm getting my life back together. He goes, one night I get off work, crack open a beer, hanging out, watching Sports Center. Knock comes at the door. Opens the door. It's his girlfriend or his ex-girlfriend. What are you doing here? She stays the night. In the middle of the night, he gets up to go to the bathroom. She's gone. But there's no record of her being there. The next day, he finally calls a friend who calls a friend who calls a friend. She agrees, okay, here's my phone number. He calls her. How did you know where I lived? What? What are you talking about? That was you. You came over, we watched this, blah, 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 blah. That wasn't me. I don't know what you're talking about. And I told you never to call me again. I'm just calling you now to tell me, that wasn't me. Right? It's the only reason I let them give you my number. And he came to me saying, it was there until it wasn't, Nathaniel. And again, that's not a lone wolf case study. We've seen that with the Men in Black, with ghosts, with aliens, all of the above. The ability to step into our reality, get something from us, which is what she did, that entity, and then disappear into the shadows. So that is a succubus. Now, the newest research I've been doing as of late is the idea that both of them are one and the same, not separate, different incarnations of a singular intelligence. Matter of fact, This is fascinating. It's not ufology because one of the very first succubus case studies we had was from a virgin, a man, where the same succubus that kind of groomed him into consent actually manifested and handed him a child that she said he fathered. He went to a psychiatrist and said, "We got a problem." Why? "I've never, ever been intimate. I'm a virgin." So if these are allegedly different fields of research, why are they doing the same things to the same people? So both of those, again, I think those are a singular intelligence, and what our ancestors did was personify the archetype, if you will.
In the beginning, I told everybody that you are a recovering demonologist. So to
Mhm.
me, that suggests that perhaps something happened to you that
Mm.
made you leave the field. What can you comment on that?
Yes. So my research is deep and dark. So it got to a point where I was getting close to seeing beyond the veil, but there's always a measure of danger there. And so there have been times in my career where I've not just seen beyond the veil, but I've seen into the abyss. And I've actually felt myself being seen into by that same abyss. So it's impossible to experience without being experienced. And so in my research, I realized that if I'm going to be visible to them, they're going to see into me. So that happened about 2 years ago. It was the longest it's been, but that happened. And I felt it, my friend. I felt it. It was that same manifestation that I encountered as a kid. Wasn't the apparition, but it was that creeping presence into the room. I closed the book. I called my father and I said, I'm leaving. I'm going to Rhode Island for a couple of weeks. I did. And so recently, more recently, perhaps, one of the experiencers that worked with Dr. Carla Turner contacted me. And he had been into my research and was kind of getting others recruited to the research I'm doing. And he said, Nathaniel, he said, one of the entities that I encountered in the 90s came to me last night. I'm like, this can't be good. And he said that the entity told me in no uncertain terms are you to contact Nathaniel Gillis or to even mention his name to anyone else. It was around that time that I got two emails from experiencers. I had no idea who they were, different email accounts. And here's the archetype. You ready? My guides want you to know that they'll be waiting for you when you die. That's when I knew there's a problem here. And for self-preservation, I need to back up. And this is, again, if everyone wants to say that the phenomenon is love and light, we need to consider the amount of times it's taken people out in order to preserve itself in our species. Dr. Carla Turner was warned, if you keep doing this, keep exposing them, you will be dealt with. Barbara Bartholic was warned, you're due for an adjustment. She's in a car with her husband. Out of nowhere, this car comes. I'm talking about that day or days now, cuts them off. The car flips over. Her husband lands. We're after you. Matter of fact, Paulino, the late Paulino, we weren't close friends, but I was on his show before he passed. He talked about the phenomenon targeting researchers. Not every researcher, just some. And that he was worried and he listed them. And tons of people that I thought I knew who they were. He listed people I didn't even know existed. And he said all of them they were in contact with or researching an aspect of the phenomenon that this intelligence was protective of. And upon that, the phenomenon pushed them back. And my point is, if it is love and light, why is it willing to literally take people out of existence in order to preserve itself? Is it possible that those who are a threat to them, that's who they go after? That's why I left a little bit. That's why I kind of backed up.
Would you say you're retired or just taking a break?
So I still need to finish my research on necronetics, which is a combination of necromancy and genetics. That is what I believe is happening with respect to the hybridization program. When you, and I meant to say this earlier when you asked about the incubus and succubus, there are certain behavioral patterns within the incubi and succubi that are interreligious and cross-cultural. No matter the archetype, these are always present. They're the bloody footprints when you're studying a serial killer. Doesn't matter the alias or the alien. It just matters the behavioral patterns. So upon examination, the incubi was inducing the victims into sleep states, inseminating them, right? Secretions and excretions, creating a fetus, placing its consciousness into that fetus, and then basically abducting the fetus itself as its own biological avatar. We know that through demonological literature and then now in ufology. But what if I were to tell you all of those behavioral patterns are ingredients that we are seeing are all a part of one recipe? When I said earlier that the phenomenon employs ritual magic, I wasn't joking. It wasn't me being hyperbolic. It is employing ritual magic. When you're dealing with what's called the ultimate black mass or what's called the red rite, it essentially began with sorcerers or practitioners who had reached the point of not just being, I guess, good and gifted at what they're doing, right? When they were dying, they would go and they would inseminate a woman. Check. They would create a fetus inside of her. Check. They had a way to do that, mind you. They would put them into a deep sleep. And they would hover directly above them. I've had cases like this. I had a husband reach out to me where his wife was paralyzed awake in bed. And one of these things was over top of her, staring into her eyes. But my point is that the inducing of a dream state, insemination, implanting of a fetus inside the body, the collecting of the consciousness and the fetus itself, the remove, all of that is a part of one ritual called the ultimate black mass. And that was a way that these ritual magicians would self-replicate their own species. Very problematic for us, but I believe, and maybe that's another show, but that's necronetics as a whole, because I do believe that some of these beings are formerly human. But that's really what I'm working on. I wouldn't say I'm retired, my friend. I'm taking a breather and I'm collecting my thoughts so that once I return, because I've been doing shows for years, I've done hundreds. And once you do these amount of shows, you say the same things because that's where your research is. But I'll be back.
Well, if people want to look into your research, do you have a
Mhm.
website or something where people can find out more about you?
Yes, I'm no longer on Twitter. I'm no longer on Facebook. I am on Instagram. That is, that's where you guys can connect with me and follow my research. And then you can even message me too. I'm very open to that.
How do they connect with you? Is it under Nathaniel
Just,
Get?
yes, yeah, my name. Yes, sir, Nathaniel Gillis.
All right. Is there anything else that you're working on that you want people to know about?
Yes, I'm looking at certain rules that they do follow. From the dawning first breaths of my career, every lecture, I told people that they're playing by different rules because they're playing a different game. And a part of the whole masquerading of angels, if you will, it's a reference to Dr. Carla Turner, is it's the same thing when we think they're demonic, right? We start to apply demonic rules. And I guess I'll leave you guys with this: is in my lecture at the Awakening in February, I put up a picture of the Iranian spider-tailed viper. And this is the best embodiment of what I think is going on. The Iranian spider-tailed viper realized that in the midst of all the other snakes, in order for it to be present with and absent from its environment, it had to diversify its intelligence in our eyes. And so, what you have here, and you guys can look it up on YouTube, it's fascinating. You will see what looks to be a spider flipping its way back and forth out in the desert. What you won't see is that that spider is actually an extension of another intelligence that's hidden in the rock. And so what the phenomenon realized is exactly what the spider realized, was that in order to capture its prey, it had to appear as what its prey was looking to capture. And so here we have, what did it want? Well, I'll tell you what, it had an affinity for birds. But what does a bird have an affinity for? Spiders. And so if I can say this, in order to conjure us, it made us believe we were conjuring them. And by the time that bird latches onto the spider, again, this is the sharing of information. There is a sequence of events that captures the spider, but that spider is connected to the real proto-intelligence. And when that proto-intelligence manifests, there are no rules for that. This has happened over and over again. You're a demon, that's the spider. Here are the demon rules. In comes the proto-intelligence that siphons the holy water over and over again. So what I'm looking for is not the rules of the archetype, because at any point, right? Whatever that proto-intelligence is what I'm after. That's what I'm focused on. And I can only find that through behavioral patterns, not through names, slurs, right? Or archetypes, slang even. Whatever that is in the shadows, that's what I'm after. And if I could be honest with you, it's whatever is in the shadows that's after me. So there's this cat and mouse thing. He doesn't want me to do this, so but I'm doing it.
I don't know if you follow Tucker Carlson, but
Mhm.
recently he talked about that the UFO phenomena is so dark that he won't even tell his wife about it.
Yep,
Have you heard him say that? And would you think he's
I
talking about the
have.
same stuff, that ETs are demons or could be?
Well, I think that, man, there's a lot to unpack there, my friend. Number one, I don't think the DoD knows what they are. I mean, I've had some contacts, not directly from the DoD, but from people that work for them. So essentially, let me go back and say this. In 1952, because I'm going to go into what the government knows a little bit. 1952, there was a group called the Collins Elite that came into existence. And these were allegedly a group of religious zealots, according to Lou Elizondo. They were focused on the connection between the occult and ufology. It's fascinating. But in their research, they were taking soil samples directly from real crop circles in England, testing them. And they noted two anomalies. Number one, it was a cellular anomaly. Number two, there was an energy signature present in the samples that weren't present in other samples of soil nearby. What they did is went back to the laboratories, began to perform what's called ritual magic. They had performed ritual magic, and in their experiments, the phenomenon incarnated. They then tested those soil samples, and they had the same cellular anomaly and the same energy signature. So the connection between ritual magic is not a bug. Again, it's a feature. Now, that doesn't mean these are demons, right? I've kind of hopefully punched some holes in that theory, but it does mean that they're practitioners of some sort. But with respect to what they know, I would suggest to those who are watching that it has far less to do with the demonic and much more to do with reality and the programmers of reality. I mean, that's what I've been hearing, right? It's not just okay, we don't have control of our skies. It's literally, can they pull us out of our own bodies with or without our own permission? I mean, this is another aspect of ufology people don't pay really close attention to, my friends. If we're talking about an entity that can peel us out of our own bodies, forget about technology. We don't have vocabulary for that. It's literally outside of our linguistic experience. So yes, that's what I believe he's referring to, is not just that we don't have a frame of reference, but I can make you into two people, right? Betty Luca walked into a room and she saw her husband in two places at once.
Earlier, you mentioned that this being or these beings have to answer to, which
Mhm.
to me means have to answer to somebody or some being.
Yes.
Where does God play a role
Mhm.
in all of this? If
Well,
there
I'll tell you
is,
what, it's an interesting question. So we have cases, okay, where people will call on Jesus and Jesus manifests. 90% of the time, it's not the historically accurate Jesus. It's not, right. It's not the biblical record. He's not the first century Yeshua or the Jewish rabbi. It's something, the archetype that was built inside their mind. And then it steps into that. Um, the name of Jesus has worked. And I think that's where we're going with this, is that, sometimes the name of Jesus has worked. Other times it's consistent. It makes the phenomenon worse. So it's inconclusive. Like if somebody says, okay, Nathaniel, would you claim it? Sometimes I would. Whatever, literally, I'm to the point, whatever works, works. But with respect to God, if we look at the characteristics, at least of the Christian God, we're dealing with somebody that wanted altars, wanted sacrifices, and that quite literally the Most High was determined based upon worship, based upon obedience, and based upon the like literally the honor that was given to him by his people. And so this is along the lines of the research being done in the UK even now. It's okay, if there was a correct model or a most correct model of the phenomenon, what would it be? These would be the old gods, or at least what presented itself as divine to us. And I think that would explain why it still wants altars. People aren't paying attention to this in the field, but when you have scientists completely navigating, completely walking around the scientific method and building altars to whatever this is, makes no sense. So, with respect to God, I think that it wants to become God, or it wants to become a God to people. That's where I'm at. Matter of fact, again, one of my mentors told me that he had not only met the Greys, but in a separate event, voices in unison told him to bow down and worship and bow down and worship us.
Nathaniel, before we wrap it up, is there any way you can give us a positive message?
Well, do I think there's good out there? Absolutely, I think there's good. I'm not. People call me a doomer. You're a doomer. Well, in all fairness, I have studied the darker nuances of the phenomenon, but an oncologist studies cancer, right? And so I think that my perception of the phenomenon is influenced by these case studies. And in some ways, I've kind of harped on it because not because the good doesn't exist, it's because people aren't giving experiencers a voice, certain experiencers who have something to say that's it's not positive. I had a case where a lady was trying to reach out to do it, not an interview, but a production company wanted her to be a part of a documentary where they flew me into a pool of corpses and told me to resurrect them through necromancy. Never heard from them again. So my thing is, do I believe there is light out there? Absolutely, I do. Not all humans are bad, right? But I've been studying the bad ones. And so that's why I'm here to say, hey, we need to test the spirits and not go along with each narrative just because we're told to.
Nathaniel, thank you for your message and thank you for being my guest.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.